So I already talked about the T4 convertible tank, how we tried to take the Christie suspension, make it work. The Army just ran into so many issues because they couldn't put enough armor or gun on it to work with the suspension system. So finally, one of the designers who was actually working on updating the Christie suspension system to the Army's needs, a guy by the name of Henry A. Knox, he decided to introduce his own changes to design. And that's where we get the tank behind me here, the M2 medium. So Henry Knox originally was an automobile designer, much like Christie, but he gets brought on board by the Ordnance Corps and the Inner Warriors. One of the biggest things he does with tanks is he looks at them and he goes, a tank, no matter what technology you put into it, has to be reliable and it has to be easy to fix, because he firmly believes that no matter what you do to design a tank, it's going to break down. And he's completely 100% right. So he looks at how can you make a tank reliable enough yet easy to repair. So this right here, what we're looking down here, this is one of his biggest contributions. So first of all, he creates this vertical volute spring suspension system. It's very simple, 2 springs in there, they work in tandem together to maintain a suspension system. But you notice it's a bogey unit. 2 row wheels attached together, all in one unit, support roller here on top. And the advantage of that is that as something breaks on this unit, your maintenance team doesn't have to get in there and try to take apart just the one spring or one part. You can take this entire station off, 1/3 of the whole suspension off, and just replace it with a new one. So you get a new one, you get your spare station, and the old one, the broken one, is taken back by maintenance. It's repaired in pieces, not on the vehicle, not in the field, and then it can be brought back and put on another tank as a spare. And so Henry Knox looks at that as a way to try to improve repairing the vehicles. Another thing he does, he uses a live track suspension system. What do I mean by live track? Well, first of all, you notice the track is maintained very tense. All right, the track doesn't lay down on row wheels. There's not much slack in it. By maintaining a tight connection on the sprockets and the row wheels, allows for a better ride of the tank, less vibration, and then not only are the row wheels, but the track pads are also rubber. He incorporates a lot of rubber in the tank. And that's fairly new when this tank gets introduced. And the whole idea of Knox introducing a live track system is that with less vibration through the tank, it's a much easier ride. There's some crew comfort, but that's not the point. Your gunner with less vibration can actually engage targets better through a magnified scope. But the biggest thing is that with less vibration going through the tank, there's less chance of the vibrations causing something to break apart. And I've actually been on tanks that if you get them up to enough speed and cause enough vibration, you actually watch bolts and screws and things start coming undone. So that is an actual thing to be worried about in tank design. And Knox did his best to actually get rid of it by incorporating live track. But the tank that he goes ahead and he puts the system on, well, first he puts it on some light tanks, but he puts it then on a medium tank design that originally the T4 we looked at was competing for. This originally starts out as T5, but becomes the M2 medium. The M2 medium is designed starting about 1935, going to 36, 37. Still designed though as an infantry support tank. So we talk about World War I, tank corps formula. Well, after World War I, we go to the tank corps kind of being split apart and falls underneath the infantry branch. So this tank's designed to support infantry attacks. And of course, since the Army, World War II hasn't started yet, so the Army thinks that the next World War is going to look like the last World War. So they designed this tank with an infantry support focus. So first of all, yes, you have a 37mm gun that would be in the turret. It's dismounted right now, but it's the same gun that would be later mounted in the Stewart tank. So you'd have a 37mm gun, but no less than 9 machine guns on board. This thing is designed to create a blossom of machine gun fire, suppressing the enemy, allowing the following infantry to attack. Case in point, you see here you have 2 little ports up front. Those are machine gun ports for the driver to operate. So even the driver gets his own machine guns, much like an old World War I fighter plane. As the driver's driving, he's got triggers on his sticks, he pulls them, and these would be sighted to about 200 yards away, allowing him to kind of, as he zigzags across the battlefield, lay down suppressing fire against enemy positions. Interesting feature of this vehicle, if you come around back to the side, watch your step here, that's ammo can actually to the T4. We actually got other components for the T4 back here. So interesting thing is, here we have the radial engine for this tank. All right, radial engines, very powerful. They're actually the most powerful American engines at the time. Very easy to replace because everything's contained in one unit, and you don't need fancy cooling systems. All you need is the ability of air to go through, and the radial cools itself. But because you use a radial and you're allowing it to cool itself, you have to use a very loose mesh grate system to allow the air to go through. So that was concerned that this was vulnerable to enemy infantry attack with either grenades or charges. So one of the things they designed with this tank to kind of protect the rear end of it is they put these ricochet plates on. And so what happened is, let's say you're going over an enemy trench system, the rear gunners on the tank would actually fire, hitting this plate, causing the rounds to bounce down behind the tank into the trench you just crossed. Really interesting concept, but very quickly it gets faded away because they realize that if you're attacking an enemy trench system, you're most likely being followed by your own infantry, and normally they don't like you shooting backwards towards them. So I can see how that would be concerning, and so eventually this idea goes away, but very, very interesting idea. And we do know that they actually used it in training here at Fort Benning. There's a trench system still in existence on post from that period with rounds, casings everywhere, and photos of these tanks actually conducting assaults. So the M2, though, is extremely important because it becomes the primary tank for the early armored force. So I mentioned going to the 1920s and 30s, the tank corps falls underneath the infantry branch. Well, finally in 1940, there's this great big discussion, and finally Congress approves the creation of an armored force, an independent armored force in 1940. So the first two units to stand up, you actually have what's the 7th Mechanized Cavalry Brigade that actually proves the concept of an armored force during the Louisiana Army maneuvers. They stand up at Fort Knox as the 1st Armored Division. Down here, the infantry tank units consolidate here at Sand Hill, right where we're standing, and become 2nd Armored Division. So this tank actually could have very well been in this motor pool in 1940. And that's what this motor pool was designed for. Like I said, it was initially built in 1940, became operational in 41. The overhead crane systems would have been used to remove the turrets off of this tank and the light tanks at the time. The problem is once the M3 Lee and then the M4 Sherman are introduced, they're actually too tall for the overhead crane system, and so this building was actually obsolete as designed. So eventually what they did was they actually put larger, taller crane outside to remove a Sherman's turret. So it is very interesting how we're trying to build all this infrastructure to support armored units, but our technology was actually going faster than our building could go. So this tank, though, eventually they want to put a bigger gun on it, but the problem is we can't make a turret big enough. We want to use cast turrets because our welding capability isn't that good at the time, and we don't want to use ballistic rivets or ballistic bolts, and rivets because there are also weak points that if a round hits them, you can cause a spawn effect, causing the inside of the rivet to actually pop off and bounce around inside. So we want a cast turret, but we can't make them at the time. So what we do is we take a 75mm gun, we put it on the side of the M2 medium, that becomes the M3 medium tank, the Lee, and then eventually, of course, the M3 Lee gets a bigger turret, becomes the M4 Sherman. So this tank, it's the grandfather to the Sherman tank and pretty much the most important vehicle, in my opinion, of the U.S. Army going into World War II vehicles. So this is the M3 Stewart. So we already talked about how we go from the M2 light tank to the M3 light tank. This one was actually just finished being rebuilt and restored just in the last couple months, or excuse me, last year or so. Was restored essentially just from an empty hull found in the woods in Alabama. Very early M3 Stewart. So first of all, you notice lots of riveting construction, which we eventually tried to get away from. Also has machine guns. Again, looking at more machine guns. So it has 2 machine guns mounted on the side of the tank for the driver to control. Now this turret that we have here that we restored weighs approximately, I want to say it's about 1,500 pounds. But if you do your maintenance right, you get the rollers working again, it works just like it used to. And like I said, this was just a solid rusted Hulk when we got our hands on it. So really pleased. So this will actually represent a tank, probably most likely like the 192nd or 194 tank battalions in the Pacific during the early conflicts between us and Japan in December 1941 going to early 1942. So she'll represent early U.S. armor. So this is what she will be opposing in the new building. This is our Type 95 Haggo tank. Not many of these left in the world. This one's been in the collection actually since 1945. This was actually captured in the Philippines by U.S. soldiers, combat veteran. Fairly complete vehicle, missing some interior components. But a lot of times we like to use this to talk about, why did the Japanese, this is the medium tank, comparing this to the Sherman, comparing this to the Panther, why is it so small? And a lot of people, when we're talking about, well, it's because Japanese soldiers were shorter. Well, at the time, that was a myth that was just wrong. Really what it shows is that in the 1930s, when this tank came out, it was actually considered one of the best tanks in the world. It's actually based a lot on the Vickers tanks put out in England. But this, combining some features from the Vickers tanks, some of the Czechoslovakian tanks, was considered advanced in about 1932-33. Within a few years, it becomes obsolete. The Japanese don't do anything to improve it, to make another tank really, because they realize that fighting in an island campaign, they think tanks aren't going to be very worthwhile strategically. And you look at how would this tank get to the battlefield. So you're flying islands. The island you may be on may not have a harbor port. If it does have a harbor port, it's probably going to get bombed either by your aircraft carrier fleet or the enemy's aircraft carrier fleet. So they look at these tanks having to be small enough anyway to be transported by barge, which is going to be slow. You can't transport a lot of them. And so very quickly as the war's starting, Japanese they're not giving enough resources to their armored force. It's not to say the Japanese armored force wasn't good. It's not to say that these tanks weren't good. They did exceptionally well in the Philippines and in China. But it just shows how the Japanese really kind of early on kind of abandoned tank development. And unfortunately for them, not for us, by the time they realized the mistake, they couldn't catch up. Now, for us, we're very lucky because not only do we have the M4 Sherman tank, which Sherman tank has no problem taking these out, we also design things to get the Sherman to the battlefield, especially LSTs, landing ship tanks, these giant ships that they just come right onto the shore, open up, Sherman tank drives out, right onto the battlefield, ready to engage. Completely changes the dynamic of expeditionary armor for the Pacific. And that's just very important to talk about strategically. You can have these great tanks, but if you can't get them to the battlefield, it doesn't matter. But if you can get them to the battlefield, you can do amazing things with them.
Thank you guys for watching our tour today. It was my pleasure to bring this to you. I love this place. I love these people. They're doing an awesome job keeping history alive. So make sure, as Rob mentioned, to follow his Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram here for the collection. I'm gonna link that down below. And if you liked these collections and the tanks and you wanna see some more, like this video and subscribe here to my channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys next time with some more tanks.